So if you got your notes, I want to encourage you. You can write this in. We're going to spend a little bit of time of talking about 4 key lessons from a stumbling faith traveler. The first one is this. What can we learn from this story of Abram? Number 1, God often uses a crisis to test our faith. Have you ever discovered this in your life? God often uses a crisis to test our faith. If you remember the story that we talked about last week, God says to Abram, go to a land that I will show you. The place that he was sending him was Canaan. And when he gets there, there is a famine in the land. We don't know exactly if it's just no rain and not producing crops, if the insects have just wiped out. He doesn't have anything to eat. And here's the key thing that you have to understand from verses 10 to the end of the chapter. Up to that point, God has spoken to him, and he has called upon the name of the Lord. And what we find here in these verses that we just read, there is no prayer going on at all. Abram's not seeking God, he's making his own decisions. And it says there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. I said it earlier, and I believe this. Many times when we start taking steps of faith, there's going to be resistance, and there's going to even be tests. God tested Abraham. This is not the only test that he will have. And God doesn't test us so that he will understand what we're going to do. He knows what we're going to do. God tests us so that we will see what we're going to do. It's an examination of our faith, of where we really put our trust. And in this moment of crisis for Abram, he decides, I'm not going to stay in the land that God has called me to anymore. I'm going to head in a different direction and go to where I know that there's food and water, Egypt. And many of us would say, well, that seems like a wise move, except God didn't tell him to do that. I was about 18 years of age, went to Stanislaus State University. I was there with the desire of getting a degree in pre-law. As some of you know, I wanted to be an attorney. That was my desire. I was dating Rachel, who is my current wife. Sorry to say that. That came out wrong. Who is my wife, my only wife, my first and my last wife. So we were dating at the time. I'm so glad she wasn't here for that. Anyway, we're going to cut that out of the video, just to let you know. So, and if you tell her, no, I'm just kidding. So, but the reality, we had been dating for many years at that point in time. And in the process of this, God began to get a hold of my heart and my life. There were some things that were happening for me, probably a little bit of my Abraham moment, where I felt God calling me into ministry. It was going to be a change of the direction of my life. I wasn't going to be at a state school anymore. I was going to go to a Christian college. Rachel and I were going to get married. I remember sitting down with her parents, and we had been dating at that point in time for almost 6 years. We started dating very early in high school, and so sat down, asked for her hand. I remember her dad, very specifically, coming to me and he said, Brian, I know you want to marry my daughter. How are you going to provide for her like we have? And I said, you may not know this, I'm going into ministry. I'm not going to provide for her like you have. We're going to try, but I was pretty confident. And we moved up to where everybody wants to go, Red Bluff, California, and I went to school up in Redding, California, and I had a job at a small church up there. I was supposed to be getting a certain severance every month to be their high school intern pastor, and my wife was supposed to have a job at the hospital. She drew blood. She was a phlebotomist, and we moved up there, and we were starting this brand new journey of trusting in God. And up to that point, God had made so many things so clear until we moved there. We got married. We moved into this place that God had miraculously provided for us, and then started to work, and I learned some things about church life that I didn't realize. The pastor had not cleared it with anybody about me getting any kind of pay, and so I didn't get paid there for the first 5 months of my time there, which when you're in college and you don't have another job, that's pretty important. And my wife was supposed to be working at the hospital there, and they kept stringing her along for the first several weeks, until finally we started to realize we do not have any resources. The very thing that was plaguing my mind about, am I going to be able to provide for this man's daughter, like I said that I was going to, was a crisis. And it could have easily led us to a place of, man, we want to jump ship, we got to find something else to do. As a matter of fact, we were so poor, this is your part, how poor were you? We were so poor. The first month, just to make payments, actually the first 2 months, if you guys were at our wedding, we got married up here and gave us gifts, your gift probably went back to the store, just so that and I say that if it was a nice gift in particular. So we needed money for food and resources. We had nothing. And I remember this was a moment where I realized we were in a difficult spot, was that Christmas, our youth kids, typically you raise money for people who are in need. Our high school kids raised money for Rachel and I, and they brought it to our house. It was like $47 and a handful of cents. And they're like, we know you guys are in desperate need. Here you go, right? We've raised all we had, And I was like, that's sweet, but we're struggling. And it could have been an easy spot, to be honest with you, that it's like, what are we doing? And there were moments of that. And I want to bail out. Because that's what we typically do when we start hitting the crisis. For most of us, anybody here like tests in your life? Anybody? No. Did anybody like tests in school? Don't raise your hand because people can't stand you, right? Nobody likes that. Nobody likes the tests. And when we start hitting the crises of our lives, and for some of you, you're in that right now, there's this pressure, there's this feeling, and you want to bail out of it. And I want to encourage you, instead of running to the place where you think, this will fix my problem, maybe the place that God's asking us to run is just to Him. And to say, do I really believe, God, that you called me up to this college to marry this woman, to pursue full-time ministry, to be a part of this church, even though it's not working out the way that I thought it was going to work out? And the issue is, you're not going to experience just one crisis in your life. How many of you realize you're going to have tests throughout your life? It's a journey. And it's God's moments in your life to say, I want to test you, to grow you. He doesn't want to break you. He wants to build you. Testing, God gives it so that He will develop our faith. Temptation, Satan brings it so that he will destroy our faith. That's the difference. God wants to develop us. As a matter of fact, the half-brother of Jesus, James, wrote these words in James chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. God's goal is to develop you. Abraham hears this moment, he goes to the land, and then he feels the crisis, and he runs in his own wisdom someplace else. Can I ask this? What's your famine today? What is the test in your life that you're experiencing? Maybe for some of you, you trusted God in a work decision and you started a new job and it has not worked out the way that you thought and you want to run. Maybe God's developing patience, perseverance, persistence, character. For some of you today, maybe you got married believing, man, this is your spouse for me. I'm trusting you in this, and your marriage is not working out the way that you thought. Is God testing you and developing you? Maybe it's heading to church. Maybe it's getting on track spiritually for the very first time. You've never taken that step, but you're doing that now, and God's developing that in you. Don't run from that. Maybe it's getting involved in a small group. Maybe it's a ministry opportunity or a missions opportunity, and you're pushing into that, and yet you feel this resistance. Can I encourage you? God's going to use crisis at times to test us, to develop us. Because tests reveal what we really believe. They really do. Just like a test reveals what you know, tests reveal to us what we really believe. So the important question in a test is not how can I get out of this, but rather what can I get out of this? God's going to test us. God is going to test us. And so because of this, Abram goes to Egypt, not into the land that God has told him to go. And this is what I find interesting. The next series of events is one bad decision can often lead to another bad decision. It's like the domino effect, right? You find yourself, you make one bad choice, financial, maybe one bad choice with relationships, and then all of a sudden the dominoes start going down. And this is what we find ourselves here in. And for some of you today, may I just encourage you with this? Sometimes the problem with our decision making is you always find yourself in the wrong place. You're spending your time with the wrong people, and so they lead you into making decisions that you know are not healthy decisions. I've met some people, young people, who are boyfriend and girlfriend, and they're like, hey, you know what? We want a sexually pure relationship, Brian, but we're struggling to do that. I'm like, well, why are you struggling to do that? Well, I don't know. We just find ourselves engaged with that. Well, then stop being alone in a house by yourself, right? I mean, it's not that difficult. Being in the wrong place often leads us to making very poor decisions. But the second thing that we're going to find out here is that we can be driven by fear or by faith, but not both. You and I can be driven by fear or faith, but not both. Look at what Abram then happens. It says this, as he went to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. How many of you ladies would love to hear that? Oh, I know what a beautiful woman you are, Sarai. But then there's something attached to this. There's more to it. It's just not a compliment. He says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Now, I just want to pause for a brief moment. Sarai is not necessarily in the prime of her life at this time. She is 65 years of age. And Abram's here saying, girl, you got it going on, right? That's what's happening. And you are a beautiful woman, and we're going to head to Egypt. She could be the golden bachelorette, if you know what I'm talking about right now. The problem is she's married. Did you catch it? This is his wife, and he's fearfully driven. And can I tell you something? Have you ever realized fear has an incredible imagination? Oh, yeah, it'll start churning stuff in your mind, right? Somebody gives you a call. We need to chat. Zzz, what are we going to talk about? And you start making conversations, if you're anything like me, 1,000,000 miles a minute of trying to figure out what do they want to talk to me about. And all they want to say is, hey, I really like you. You're doing a great job, right? And you've spent hours thinking about stuff in your mind. Your boss calls you in. You know you haven't been doing stuff the right way. Fear starts, zzz, and you just start going off. And you can be driven by fear, or you can be driven by faith. But you cannot be driven by both. Abram's heading into Egypt, a place where he shouldn't be to begin with, and all of a sudden fear starts taking over. They're going to kill me because of you. They're going to take my life because of you. And I just ask you this, when you think of your future and what's coming down the road, are you more fear-driven or faith-driven? Are you thinking of what God's going to do in your life, or are you thinking of all the possibilities of what can go wrong in your life? Because you can be fear-driven or faith-driven, but you cannot be both. Let me give you some examples of what fear does. Fear produces scheming. It produces scheming in our lives. Look at what Abram says next. Tell him that you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. He comes up with a plan. You're going to tell him you're my sister, which, by the way, it is a half-truth. You can read the scriptures and discover this. But it's not the full truth. Anybody here ever been guilty of half-truths in your life? Yeah, we typically go to our kids, right? That's where we go, oh yeah, my kids do that all the time. And we see that, but if we're honest, I think a lot of times we get there. We get caught doing something that we shouldn't. Well, I didn't really, and we start making excuses, and we start scheming and coming up with a plan. Maybe if you're honest, you just straight up lie. You have an alcohol problem, and instead of being honest about it, you hide it under the sink. And then when you're caught, oh, I don't know how that got there. Really? Did the alcohol fairy come and drop that off? Or what happened here? You're fearful of finances, and so instead of being totally truthful with selling of your vehicle or taxes, you kind of fudge numbers a little bit. Well, that's kind of true. How's the car running? Pretty good. The brakes are bad, but that's not running. That's stopping. So, and you justify a million things, right? And we start scheming, and that's what fear does in our life. Abram is guilty of this. And instead of that whole verse that we all know so well, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on what? Your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. What happened to this guy who said, I'll leave everything that I know, I'll go to a land that I don't even know where it is yet, because God, I trust you, that he can't even walk into Egypt and say, that's my wife. I trust God to protect me. That's my wife. The second thing is scheming hurts those around me. Scheming hurts those around me. If you want to start living a scheming life, you start the scramble, right? It's what happens. It's what fear does to us. And in verses 14 through 15, it said this, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians did see Sarai, and she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And this is probably the part that Abram didn't figure was going to happen. What happens? And she's taken into his palace. The king of all of Egypt realizes how beautiful she is, and that's the one that wants to marry her. Uh-oh. This went to a whole new level. I just thought it'd be one of these guys that was checking my wife out, but now it's gone to the top guy. And in this moment, scheming now has influenced and hurt people that he cared. How many of you ladies right now would be thinking, I would love to be Abram's wife there? I mean, I feel so protected and valued. Anybody? Probably not. You think that might have had an impact on their relationship later? I guarantee it. And it's these moments, right, of instead of stepping up to the plate, Abram cowers, and he doesn't have faith that God's going to trust him, and he puts his wife in a situation that probably hurts. I wonder even for him if he's thinking, what's going on in the palace? Now, some of you right now are thinking, did this guy sleep with her? I mean, did Abram put her in that kind of a situation? Well, it was usually custom that there was a time period before these rulers. If you look at the book of Esther, there was a year time period where that king was preparing for a wife. In this situation, it's been said that they would wait several months just to make sure the woman was not pregnant with another man's child, something along those lines. It's the most likely probability is the Pharaoh did not have any relations with her. But Abram puts her in a situation that she should have never been in. And gentlemen, can I be honest with you for a moment? I'm actually looking for an answer. Yes, can I be honest with you? You guys are like, I don't know. What do you want to say first? If you're married today, step up and protect your wife. Be the man that God's called you to be. Because some of you get your wife to lie for you about things, cover up about things. You're not leading her spiritually like you should. Some of you are not taking care of her needs, and you're putting her in a position that there's a temptation outside of that. Can I be really up? And some of you are like, man, you don't know my wife. She nags. Well, she's probably nagging because she's telling you something that's lacking and that she needs. Man, it is our responsibility to love our wives as Christ of the church, to step up and to protect them. Not to be an Abram in this moment where it's a lie that puts her in peril, but to be a man who steps in the gap and says, God, you've called me to protect my wife, to protect my family, and that's the type of man that I want to be. Can I hear an amen? At least from you wives. And can I be really honest for a moment, since I already hit the guys? I don't know why I'm even saying this. This just kind of came to me. Listen, every once in a while I come home with some flowers for my wife. I do that periodically. A lot of times it's after marriage counseling meetings when I've been with some women that I'm like, oh my goodness, and I take a thing of flowers. My wife's like, rough meeting? I said, yes, thank you for being the most wonderful, amazing woman I have ever met in my life. So don't be a wife that is not worth protecting. So all of us work towards this marriage thing. And here's what we see next. Not only does it affect Sarai, not does it only affect Abram, it ends up impacting Pharaoh and his entire household. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife. This is what sin does. This is what a lack of faith will do in our life. There is always a ripple effect. The third thing here, scheming destroys my testimony. Would you just say that with me? Scheming destroys my testimony. Abram's supposed to be this man of faith. Do you remember what it said about him? That he was going to be blessed so that he can be a blessing to whom? All the nations. You're supposed to be a blessing to everybody else. He comes into Egypt, and what happens? Everybody gets a disease in Pharaoh's household because of him and his wife, because of his bad decision. And how do you think Pharaoh found out? Well, let me just read this. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and get out of here. Abram's testimony is destroyed. He can't even be honest. He can't even say, I believe in the God who has called me to this new land, and I trust him so much that I would be totally transparent with you guys, not running in fear for my life. And when we get to the spot where we're scheming and living a life of fear, our testimony is destroyed. And lastly, if you're taking notes, confidence is the result of a faith-driven life. Fear-driven stuff gets us to scheming, hurting people, destroying our testimony. Faith-driven life leads to confidence. My hope and my prayer for you this morning is that you would want to be an individual that says, I'm walking through this season of my life, even though it might be challenging and difficult, but I know that God is in control and I'm trusting him in this. And it just gives me a confidence that can only come from him, because where God guides, he's going to provide, and I can trust him. I will take him at his word. Number 3 here, tests that aren't passed are often repeated. Tests that aren't passed are often repeated. In a couple of weeks, we're going to come to this, but in Genesis chapter 20, the same situation happens again. And how many of you think Abraham learned his lesson? He did it the right way. He doesn't. He does the same thing again. And I'd be willing to bet that there are some of us in this room right now that you keep feeling, why does this same thing keep happening in my life over and over and over again? Maybe it's in your relationships. Maybe it's in your dating relationships. I don't know why. I just can't find a good guy. I can't find a good Christian girl. Well, where are you looking? Well, you're looking in terrible places. You're justifying things. You're afraid to be alone. And instead of just trusting God that his timing will work, you're always pushing it. And we can go down that road in a multitude of things. Finances, right? Oh man, I'm in a financial crisis. Everything seems to be blowing apart. And then all of a sudden, God comes in and rescues. Maybe there's a somebody gives me a gift, somebody helps me out. God miraculously provides. And 6 months later, I'm still in the same spot again because I'm repeating the same test over and over. That old saying, right? You're spending money you don't have to buy stuff you can't afford to impress people you don't even like. Just stop it, right? Get to that place where, God, why does this test keep coming up? Because if they are not passed, they're probably going to be repeated in your life. I feel like I'm going through that in my own life personally right now. I feel like there's some things that God keeps stirring up over and over, and I'll just be honest with you what it is. It is getting to a place where I'm not as emotionally driven. I don't think that I'm an emotionally driven person, but there are things in my life that impact me. It's usually people. And I allow people to impact my life in such a way that I get discouraged. I get to a place where it's like, man, God, do I even want to continue doing what you're calling me to do? And whatever it may be, instead of getting to the spot of, God, people can do whatever they want. I'm going to trust in you because you're calling me to do this. I'm going to push my feelings and my emotions behind me and follow you in faith and keep doing what you've called me to do until you change the circumstances. That's the test that I'm going through. Am I passing it all the time? No. Is God still developing that in me? Yes. And I wonder if God may be doing that in your life too. Because not only do we pass, if we don't pass it, we'll keep repeating it. Later on, in the book of Genesis, Abraham's own son does the exact same thing that he does. And if you know anything about Abraham's grandson, a man by the name of Jacob, his name means deceiver, and he does the same things. And can I tell you, for parents right now, there may be some of us that we need to get some passing tests because our kids are observing us. They're watching what we're doing. And if we're people of half-truths, what do you think the example is that we're setting to our kids? If we're people that are drinking to drunkenness, what do you think is the example that we're setting to our kids? If we're people that walk into church one way saying, Jesus, you're awesome, and then walk out and our lifestyles have nothing to do with God, what do you think is the example that we're setting to our kids? I have no idea what tests it may be in your life. Maybe relationships, maybe you keep bumping into the same problems. Maybe it's in work, you keep bumping into the same problems. Maybe it's conversations with people. Maybe it's a conversation with one particular person that you go, why do I keep feeling this way? Because God's putting it on you. It's time to have a conversation. But you keep bumping into these things, and instead of walking through the crisis and the test, you're trying to jump ship. And last thing, we will all stumble, but failure doesn't have to be final. We will all stumble, but failure doesn't have to be final. We get to the end of this, and Pharaoh says, get out of here. And I find it really fascinating what happens next. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold, which I know some of you, by the way, are saying, didn't he get that from Pharaoh? Didn't Pharaoh give that to him? Man, he scored. God blessed him for being deceitful. Can I tell you something? One of the things that he got was a maidservant. Her name is Hagar. And in a couple weeks, we're going to talk about the devastation that that relationship brings into what's going on. Our sin always has a ripple effect. It just does. Abraham became very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold, and from the Negev he went to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. Do you find that interesting? Where's he back at again? Where he started. And there, Abraham does what? He called on the name of the Lord, which is what he should have done in the first place. I was having a conversation with a couple quite a while back. They're going through a crisis in their life, spiritually, maritally, family, financially, work. I mean, all of it. It's just flipped upside down. And as I was listening to the conversation and navigating some stuff through and kind of hearing them out, I finally just asked the question, well, you know what? About a year ago, none of those things were happening. So what's different? They weren't involved in church. God wasn't the priority of their life. They'd gotten away from small groups. They got away from spending time with God. They got away from seeking after Him. And their whole world flips upside down. And I'm just wondering if there may be a few of us here today that you, if you're honest, you're stumbling right now in your faith journey. And I want to just let you know that failure does not have to be final. But you might have to go back to where you started from, where you got off track and say, Lord, I want to get back on track with you. And call upon the name of the Lord. And be willing in faith to say, I got myself here. I'm going to get back to you, Lord, and I'm going to start following your directives for my life. I'm going to be a person of faith. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to stay where you're calling me to go. I'm going to make you a priority of my life. I'm not going to keep walking in the same directions as I was before. And so as we look at Abraham's life here, I think it's pretty fascinating that God is a promise keeper even when Abram is not. God stays the same. How many of you are so grateful that He stays the same, whether you stay the same or not? As a matter of fact, the scriptures tell us that God is faithful even when we are faithless. I love that verse Paul wrote to Timothy. He is, because He is a promise-keeping God. And so for some of us here today, maybe you're in this season where you're going through some tests. I want to encourage you, don't run from them. Press into them. Press into them and come out on the other side stronger because of it. For some of us here today, maybe you're in this season where it's going to be a fear-driven life or a faith-driven life. Are you going to scheme? Are you going to try and manipulate things? Or are you going to trust God and live in confidence to say, you've called me to it, God, you're going to see me through this. I can believe you, and I'm not going to let my life impact others negatively. I'm going to allow my life to impact others in a positive manner. Maybe you're in the repeated test, and today is a day of saying, you know what, Lord? I'm going to do things differently your way this time and not trust in my own understanding. And maybe you realize you've made some decisions that have led you down the wrong path. And today is a day of getting back on track with Him to say, I want to meet you again. God, I want to call on your name. I want to live a life that is faith-fueled, not fear-driven. And we've been talking about tests, and so I was thinking about this. There may be a few of you in here this morning that are in a different season of your life. You're in a season of just developing a relationship with God. And since we talked about tests just a moment ago, I want to let you know that for each and every one of us, there's a test that we have all taken that we didn't do so well on. It's called the righteousness test. And the Bible tells us there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who seeks God. As a matter of fact, Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so when we look at the test and God grades our lifestyle, we may do well in certain little areas, but on the big picture of it all, I know what He says for me. He says, Brian, you got an F on that one. I've never gotten one. No, I probably have gotten one of these in my school career. I don't remember it, but man, nobody likes that. And spiritually speaking, can I just tell you something? That is where all of us stand with God. On our own efforts. You can never get an A. Your righteousness will never lead you there. But the simple truth is, God sent His Son Jesus, and Jesus lived an absolutely perfect and sinless life. And when the Father looks at Him He says A+. And I just imagine Jesus and I sitting in the class, me with my F, and him with his A+. And I'm sitting there going, this does not look good for me. And Jesus saying, do you want to swap? Do you want to swap? Because God in his love sent his son Jesus Christ to get an A+, not to just prove that Jesus was so great. He sent his son into the world to die for you and for me. And as the scripture says in Romans 3:23 and following, that all have sinned and we all fall short of the glory of God, but we are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came through Jesus Christ. And God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by what? Faith. And in that moment that I say, Jesus, I believe you came and you died for my sin, the sin that I could not get rid of in my life. He says, you know what? I'll take your score and you take mine. And the beautiful thing about this is the day that I see God, when I die or Jesus Christ comes, whatever comes first, and I see him face to face and he goes, why should I allow you into heaven? I don't have to sit there and be driven in fear going, I got an F, I didn't do so well on earth, I failed many tests, you know that, God. I can say, your son Jesus paid the price for me, and because of that, I have been given his righteousness, and I stand forgiven of all of my sin, and I am justified just as if I have never done that because of the perfection of your son Jesus Christ. And if you are here today and you've put your faith in Jesus, you have that promise. But I want to talk to those of you who have never taken that step of putting your faith in Christ, that maybe that is the biggest step of faith for you this morning. To say, I'm not trying to earn a relationship with God anymore because I could never do it. I believe Jesus paid it for me. And all we can do is receive that gift. You say, well, what is that going to cost me? Well, I'm going to tell you this. Salvation and being made right with God is a free gift. But it'll cost you the rest of your life. But there's no greater life to live than one that's sold out by faith to him. And if you've never taken that step this morning, in a moment, we're going to say a simple prayer where you can invite Jesus Christ to be the Lord of your life, that you know you would be forgiven, and that when that test comes, when you stand before God face to face, you can say, I've passed, not because of my works, but because I put my faith in your son, Jesus Christ. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? God, I thank you for the examples that you give us in Scripture. Men like Abraham that in moments had tremendous faith and in other moments failed. Because God is such a picture of our own lives, the things we do. And God, I got to believe that in a crowd this size that there are some of us right now that we're going through some crisis, some difficult moments, some very challenging times to our faith. And I pray that you would give endurance and perseverance, that on the other side of that test and that exam, faith would be developed, it would be grown, a dependency upon you would be greater than it ever has before. Father, I pray for some of us as we're navigating through life that right now, if we're honest, our lives are more fear-driven than faith-driven. Maybe we're scheming, hurting people along the way, doing some devastating things. Lord, I pray that we would shift our mindset, our thinking, our behaviors to be in alignment with you. God, for those who are repeating similar tests here today, that you would help us to see the patterns and what you're trying to develop in us so that we would grow. And would you remind us all that there are going to be times when we stumble and skin up our knees, maybe even fall down for a season and for a while, but it doesn't have to be final. Thank you that you are a God of grace and compassion and mercy, and that you are a promise-keeping God. And what you did for Abraham, the promises that you keep, you still do today. And thank you for loving us at times when we're unlovable. And if you're here right now, and maybe for the very first time in your life, or maybe you've been getting it, but you realize today is a day of a faith step for you, that you know You're standing before God right now, you're failing because you're not righteous and you're not perfect and there is sin in your life. But you want to make that incredible exchange to release your sin and your guilt and experience God's grace and forgiveness by putting your faith in His Son, Jesus, and what He's done for you. And if that's you right now, I would encourage you maybe to say just a simple prayer like this to get that journey going. God, you know every detail of my life. And I've sinned, and I admit that. And I'm far from you. But I believe you sent your Son, Jesus, to die for me. And so right now, in this moment, I put my faith in you, Jesus. I give you my sin, and I receive your grace. And I ask you to help me walk in faith to you for the rest of my days. In Jesus' name we pray.